This is the
All
Lambda
right.
Cartel. Ah, sorry. This is the Lambda Cartel. Today we have MJ Alwajeeh. I hope I didn't kill your last name. We're going to be talking. Sorry, MJ is going to be presenting or giving us a quick look into Microsoft Azure. For those of you who don't know, MJ is an Azure fanatic and great developer and all around great guy. And he's been a supporter of the Lambda Cartel. He told us that he has suffered through several episodes of our podcast, so I think that gives him enough street cred to be here doing this with us. So thank you, MJ, for doing this, and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Pablo. And you did a wonderful job pronouncing my last name, so that was perfect.
Yes.
Um, all right. So I think I'll just maybe take a second to explain how this transpired. So Pablo just reached out on Twitter, and we were talking about Azure, and then he just suggested that maybe I could do a show and tell about how I use Azure. So, I didn't quite prepare some sort of elaborate presentation or anything. I just thought it would be, me start off by just, log into Azure, talk about a few of the things that I do there, and then maybe touch on a few services that I like that I kind of think are pretty exciting. And then it can be interactive. And then if there's any questions or whatnot, we can kind of dig into it and take it from there. So that's kind of my plan. Not too rigid. So without further ado, I'll get started. I've logged in here to portal.azure.com. That's the main portal. I'm not sure the level of familiarity that everyone has with Azure already.
Assume that we have very low familiarity with it.
Okay, perfect. So basically, I'll just give you, a quick tour of the portal. I think that's usually the first thing that you're gonna interact with on your journey. One quick kind of bit of history there is that there used to be another portal, which was the classic portal, which is called the classic portal now, and this is the new portal. So for a while, this was called the new portal, but it's now just the regular portal. This has a little bit of an interesting kind of user navigation scheme. So some people get surprised when they first start using it. I personally have grown to like it. I prefer it actually. So I just want to give you kind of an overview of how I use it, and then it takes a little bit of playing around with it to get into it. So when you log in, you're faced with this. This is a dashboard. You can have several dashboards here, so I usually kind of use that to organize different views into the set of resources that I have. Over here, you have your top bar, your search, and then on the left-hand side is a bunch of the services that Azure provides. So, there is so much stuff on Azure that, I usually recommend that people don't worry about, everything that is there, because it is, a mile wide. But that just they can pick one or two services that provide the most value to them, or even the most immediate value, and just get started there. So very briefly here, I'll show you that the portal itself, you can customize a few things. So some people prefer the dark theme. So I'll just point that out. There's a little bit of customization there that you can apply, pick different themes. I personally think this one is good for presenting because it's a little bit clearer. You have here your notification hub. So most of the activities that you do here end up kind of leaving messages in your notification hub, which is pretty good. So that you can continue browsing through the portal. And then when something kind of finishes provisioning, it'll end up leaving a note in the notification. You have, keyboard shortcuts. They are a little bit interesting, but they've changed them a couple of times on me already. So I used to know them all by heart, and then a couple of changes later, I'm kind of not that familiar with them anymore, so I need to kind of review that again. But for those people who prefer to use shortcuts to navigate around, that's a good kind of resource as well. All right, so on the left-hand side here, you have the bar, the navigation bar, so to speak, the side panel. And you have this concept in Azure, which is the resource groups. I think that's where you would most people get started. This is mostly just a logical container for a group of your resources. So if we do one today, and then we'll just go with somewhere here. So let me just talk about what just happened here. We clicked on some on a brand new resource group. We want to create it. It popped this little window or pane inside the main window, the browser window that we have here. So this here is called a blade. And this is that interesting navigation scheme I was talking about. So instead of popping up, different browser tabs or even navigating the page, it actually tries to keep you inside the Azure portal. And instead, it just keeps piling on left to right additional blades as you go deeper in your, what they call it, a journey. So let me just create this one here. As an example, let's say we go to, one that already exists. We started here, it opened up this one. This is the resources contained inside this resource group. If I click on, this particular one, it now opened what looks like a brand new window, but actually it's the breadcrumb here shows you that it's just kind of carrying me on this journey from resource groups. I'm in the sandbox one, I'm in this API. And from here, I can go to something else, and it just keeps getting deeper into that journey. But then it's all still here, actually. So you can kind of browse, navigate horizontally to go back to any point in that, or use the breadcrumb to just skip back to that part. So this is the horizontal scrolling is something that, takes a little bit of getting used to. I think a lot of people have the trackpads on their Macs or even PCs and so on. So, horizontal scroll is just as simple now as a vertical scroll. And I actually have a touch screen on my laptop, so I use the screen. So I use my finger to actually navigate left and right as well. So this is pretty good. It prevents you from kind of ending up in that tab hell, as I call it, which is, when you browse other websites, you end up kind of every link, you try to create a brand new tab from that and keep going. You end up with like 40, 50 tabs in the browser, and they're all so small. The heading is so small now that you can't even tell which tab is what. So you keep opening the same tab over and over again. So this is kind of trying to design to prevent that. One thing I'll mention, just a pro tip from my side, is that I sometimes find the need to compare things side by side. So let's say this resource group versus another resource group. Maybe it's not that easy to achieve that if I'm using this single browser window or browser tab. So I may log into to Azure from a second window. And then now I'm able to achieve that kind of the ability to have two side by side, but each one is a separate kind of session, so entirely different from each other. So before we get too kind of far into the this is the the left-hand side here. This includes a few of the services that are most commonly used, but there's actually a bunch more. So if you click on more services, you'll end up with this much larger list actually. But it's this star that you can choose to turn it on or off, and that's what would determine if it ends up in the left-hand bar there or not. So use your start with the defaults, I suppose, and then over time, if you find yourself having to go to more services and filtering to get to the one that you need, for example, container. Let's say you're using the container registry a lot, then you might want to tab that one, star that one, and now it's kind of going to end up showing here. And on this side, you can even move them up and kind of organize them based on how frequently you access these different services. So I'll pause there for a second. How does that sound so far?
I am learning a lot. So I have a brief question. So resource groups are a way for you to contain or to label things that are resources that are related to one project under one umbrella.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, they're a logical container for a group of resources. Okay. How you determine what groupings, that's entirely personal choice. So you can do it by, let's say, one project, or we do it sometimes by environment. So for example, I'd group, if I have, enterprise app, and I have my dev environment, test environment, production environment, I will group all those resources for dev under one resource group that is kind of containing all my dev resources, another for my test resources, another for my prod resources. And I can control a few things that way. So I can control permissions at the group level as well. So this way I can restrict some people from getting access to some of these resource groups.
And you can clone them. Can you like clone them and say, I have one that's for production, I want to clone it and turn that one into staging, for example?
You can't clone the group because the group is really just an empty shell. So there's nothing there, and it takes it's just a logical container. But inside the group, you might have created 17 different resources to kind of represent everything here. Well, there's a bunch of configuration that needs to be done. In some cases, for example, this API that I created, I'll dig into that in a second. It actually needs, it gets like a unique name. So you cannot actually repeat the same name twice because it's going to get a certain kind of unique URL. So there is configuration involved. It's not a very straightforward kind of clone and now you have a copy, right? Because there's certain configuration. You have to pick sizing again. Maybe you have to pick names. So if there is any kind of cloning, it wouldn't be at the resource group level, and it would be mostly like that you're trying to recreate some of these resources inside it, or services inside the resource group. But again, because of configuration, I don't think I've seen the clone feature that often.
Okay, cool.
All right, wonderful. All right, so I think the main thing I want to show you guys today, I was kind of mulling it around in my head earlier. There's a lot of stuff, so I'm not sure I can show you so much stuff in the amount of time that we have, but I figured at the very least we can dig into one area that I use a lot, which is what's called app services. So app services is really, to start with, the simplest version is that it's where you're going to host your web app. So there is a few different types of app services. That's why they kind of went with the generic name of app service versus just web apps. And I'll dig into that in a second. But this is, the platform as a service offering, or, the most prominent part of the platform as a service offering from Azure. This is where you're going to create what's called, web apps or API apps, or what they call logic apps, which is kind of like orchestration type of products, let's call it, or service. So if you're familiar with BizTalk or one of these services, this is like a very lightweight version of that. That can actually go pretty far once you dig into it. And they have something called mobile apps as well, which is essentially kind of like an API, a mobile backend. So if you have a mobile app, then it needs a backend that's just a more specialized version of an API hosted on Azure. It's just makes it a little bit easier to work with a mobile app as the backend. So if I can kind of show you there. So if I go to new, this is how I spin up a new resource from the portal. Things are organized here by these kind of headings. We have here web plus mobile. And if I click on that, I get to see this variety that I was talking about. So you have, web app. Do I want to create a web app, a mobile app, a logic app, or I'm missing one here, which is, I think, an API app. But I think that's just kind of a specialized version of a web app there. So if I say, let's create a web app, now we're kind of having to configure this web app. So we're starting this new blade, and we're gonna maybe create one. And you can see here that it's already giving it, a URL, a subdomain part of Azure websites.net. So that's why it needs to be a unique name. So let's call this the Lambda demo, MJ Lambda demo. And we pick our subscription, and then right away we're kind of, because we came at it from we're creating a web app versus we started with, let's say, creating the resource group, and within that we're creating something else. So we're just having to configure it. Which resource group will this web app live in? Now, you saw me earlier, I created one for the Lambda demo that we're doing. So I'm just going to go ahead and find it and make sure that it's using that one to place this brand new created web app that I'm about to create. In terms of the, so there's a small kind of tangent there to mention. So a web app, this is going to be, you know, as far as we're concerned, it's a PaaS offering, so platform as a service. But behind the scenes, we still have to host it somewhere. So we're given this opportunity to decide the size of the machine that will host it. And that determines the price of this plan. So they have a name for that, and it's actually called the App Service Plan. So, you know, we're in the App Services, and we have to select the plan for that. So if I click on that, you can see here that, you know, it's offering me which of these App Service plans do you want to use. If I say create new, so you see here how it's kind of popping up these new blades. I want to show you what happens here, because part of configuring a web app or part of understanding web apps on Azure is understanding an app service plan, which is just a euphemism really for the behind the scenes machine or VM that will host your app. The good part is that, you know, you spin up an app service plan and you pick a certain size for it, which determines the pricing, and a certain location where it will be hosted. And from that point, you can actually create several web apps that live inside that same app service plan. So if you don't anticipate that you have really high traffic right away, then you just, you know, pick your plan, price it accordingly, and then create several apps that all can reference that same plan and be hosted on the same machine. So over here, we can go with, you know, MJ Lambda demo. So ASP. So this is, you know, something I usually do as well, is I like to give the resources this naming format. So I end it with, you know, dash, and I give it some sort of identifier. So app service plan is ASP. Usually I do for the web app, I do something like this, dash web WA, but because it's going to be part of the URL, sometimes I leave that out just to make it a little bit more readable. For resource groups, I use dash RG and so on. So this is, again, a personal preference. I like kind of to be able to tell from the name later on whether I'm seeing it in Visual Studio or somewhere else. From the portal itself, I can tell from the name right away what type of resource it is. So if we pick East US here, now we're looking at pricing tier. So by the way, guys, I live in Canada, so the prices are Canadian priced or shown in Canadian dollars. So again, something to keep in mind. You can have actually a free tier. It's quite limited in general in terms of what you can do, including the fact that you can't turn on SSL or assign it a custom domain. But it is free, so you can get started there. Depending on the type of site you have. And the prices kind of, the different sizes go up from there. So you have shared, then you get into basic, standard, and premium, and even this new level actually that they just introduced, which is they make sure it's isolated, hosted in isolation from any other apps. So it's kind of for environments like governments and banks that need that level of security. So anyway, basic plan, and then you can kind of up the size of the machine here. So that's what's determining the price differences. But usually, you know, basic one is going to get you most of the way there. It already has custom domains and SSL and all that. And, you know, the size of the machine can be changed later. So I can up the B2 to B2, B3. And I can change actually any of these choices at any later point. So just to enable most of the options for now, I'm going to select basic. And we select OK. So now I've selected this app service plan, and I wanted to mention that. So, you know, I took the tangent to explain app service plan because they're asking us to select an OS, right? So the reason why we have to select an OS is because we're actually somewhat aware of the VM that is going to host our web app. And you can use Windows, that's the default. Linux is actually in preview now, so you can select a Linux VM to be the host. And because, you know, .NET Core is making .NET stuff runnable on all the cross-platform and so on, so it's actually, you know, well supported and a good option going forward. One thing I'll show you about that, okay, I had to actually change the select that first before selecting the plans. That changes what you can, what type of plans and the prices, and they do come at a discount when you select Linux. But I'll stick with Windows for now, which we already created. I'll mention App Insights in a second. So now that we have our web app, we have the resource group identified, we have an app service plan, we can hit create. It'll take, a couple of minutes while it spins up the deployment, and you can see that we're able to kind of continue doing our work in the portal, and the notification tab here our hub will show us when it comes back. If I go to our resource groups, and we go to Lambda, and you can see here that it already finished. So it deployed that. Now, within my resource group, I can see that I now have an app service and an app service plan. And if I go to my app service, which is the web app, so this is the standard, this is the main thing I end up kind of using the Azure for. It's the suite of services that live under the app service. You can deploy your web apps, you can deploy your API apps, you can configure databases and all kinds of interesting stuff here. So let me just show you that this is already live. If I click on it, it comes with this kind of default page just to show you that it's already live, it's already on the web, and if I just deployed my code to it, it would immediately be accessible online. I'll take another pause there. Any questions so far?
I'm good.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, you're doing great.
Awesome. All right, so let me now just dig into a few things that I wanted to mention about the app service here. So to start with, this is the URL. You can connect to the kind of the www root behind the scenes where you deploy your files using this, FTP or FTPS URLs. It's all set up here. I can kind of talk about that in a second. But on this left-hand side, you get a variety of options and things you can do to this app service. So let me kind of start by showing you the application settings. This is the application settings associated with this app service. And you can already see that, it comes with .NET installed, but I can configure different versions, PHP, Python, turn on some, settings here. And even this is another kind of section I want to mention, the app settings section. So again, if you're used to kind of developing in .NET, this is usually my background is .NET, so I'll just talk about that for a second. You have your application settings or your environment settings, and you've configured them one way for your local environment, but you want to override it when you deploy it to Azure. This is where you kind of, as long as the key name is matching, you can place a value here, and the precedence will be Azure. When it's hosted in Azure, the precedence of where that value will be taken from is from this app settings pane. So this is, really good for storing, tokens and private keys and so on for services that you don't want to put into your source code. And you just have to put them here at the app settings level, and they get picked up by the application. Same thing for connection string. If you configure the connection string from here, as long as it's kind of provided the same name that your app is expecting, it's going to pull up the connection string from over here instead. So that's pretty flexible there, and kind of the primary place you're going to kind of configure on every one of your applications. Some things that we can talk about, you can customize the domain or attach a custom domain to this application, since it's currently getting that Azure Websites.net domain by default, but you can customize or attach your own domain to it. And I think they recently added the ability to buy the domain from here, from Azure Portal itself. SSL certificates. Yeah, I could talk about this here for a second. So what is the kind of the point of going with PaaS, platform as a service? A lot of that is you don't have to worry too much about the machine, the virtual machine management behind the scenes. I mean, the hardware is already taken care of. That's, IaaS, that's infrastructure as a service already. But you don't have to worry about, keeping the operating system up to date and all that stuff, patches and all that kind of, even the IaaS or any other web server that you use to set up your environment. This is all taken care of for you by Azure itself. Part of the the advantage you get right away is the ability to just change your resource consumption based on your traffic. So for one quick example here, and as you remember, the VM is actually the app service plan. So, but you get a link to it from here. But we can scale up. So, suddenly Lambda Cartel website picks up, and we're only set up for the B1 level, but we can actually just click on B3, hit select, and it will take the same amount of time that it took to provision this to actually switch us up to this higher plan. Behind the scenes, our code was neatly packaged and brought over to just a stronger VM that can support that level of traffic, and even going up in plans and so on. So that's kind of very quick to do. The other thing that I want to show you here is the scale out feature as well. So here you can actually get a little bit more, it can get a little bit more interesting as well for traffic handling. So not just the ability to scale up the size of the machine, but you can decide how many web front ends or API servers you want to be handling the requests on your behalf. So you can actually change the number of instances. So, oh, I think I might need the, yeah, sorry, I need the S1 plan for that. So actually, in order to get to the Autoscale kind of features, you need to go up to the S1 level, I think. And if we go there, so enable Autoscale. So you can see here, this is a very interesting thing. So we can kind of select the level of the number of VMs behind the scenes that are backing this service plan. So this applies obviously to the many applications that I have hosted on the same app service plan. They're all getting the benefit of this upgrade, but I can kind of select what level I want right now. So let's just say I want 2 by default, but I can also enable Autoscale rules. So this gets really interesting, where I can kind of add certain rules saying that, if the CPU percentage is above 70% for the last 10 minutes straight, then give me another instance. It will provision it by itself, and then you can actually configure the rules for, instead of auto scale out, it's scale back down. So that's interesting as well. So if you can say that, once you've scaled up to 3 instances because of the rule, if there is, less than 30% CPU percentage consumption for the next 10 minutes, then scale me back down by 1 instance, and so on. So actually, it can get very, interesting configuring these rules here, because you end up just by default selecting the bare minimum that you think your app will need that handles your average traffic, and any spikes in traffic can be handled. Peace of mind is achieved just by setting up these rules for both scaling up and scaling back down, in case it was a post on Reddit gave you the Reddit hug of death, as they call it. Then it can handle that traffic, grow to the level that is needed to handle that traffic, and when that traffic dies down, it scales back down, so you're not paying too much for the rest of the month. All right, so that's that one. And so just moving on here, there's one thing that a lot of people kind of feel a little bit frustrated by when they first start to use the PaaS offerings in any cloud provider, really, is the ability to know what's going on. And I think it's really just a matter of trying to figure out how to get to the logs and to the things that you're used to getting. I think that they're doing a pretty good job with this app service of kind of bubbling up some of the information you might need to know what's going on. For example, here we have the Process Explorer. So this is actually the Process Explorer from the machine itself. And it's bubbled it up in the portal to show you what kind of processes are running and what kind of thread counts and work memory is being consumed by these services. There is, a more advanced view of this. I'll show you in a second. But, if you go to Diagnostic Logs, this is where you can turn on application logging, web server logging, detailed error messages, failed request tracing, etc. And once you've turned on some of these things, now you can kind of monitor them. Some level of this detail can be monitored live via this log stream. So once if I turned on some logs, then hitting log stream would start to show me with a little bit of delay, maybe like a 30-second or 1-minute delay, it'll start to kind of show me a stream of the logs as they're being captured. There is actually a more advanced portal for a little bit more of this stuff. So this one here is called Advanced Tools. This portal is called Kudu, Kudu. And just going over to that one for a second, you can see there's a little bit more information. This is, based on that app service plan. We know there's a VM behind the scenes, and this is bubbling up some of that information. So, you go to this view here, the debug console, and it's actually going to give you this window where you actually can see the actual file system, at least, at the stuff that is relevant for running the site. And it's this hybrid between Windows and Bash shell. So it's a few commands work that you may be used to as well. So that's the one that we're seeing. That was the default page that was hosted that we ran the website. So you get to see that over there, and it's kind of mirrored over here if you just want to do the browse it this way. Some of the log files end up going here, so you can get at them from here. The Process Explorer as well is kind of available from here, where you can see the properties of a certain process, and then you can even see certain environment variables and so on. So it's really, even though it is abstracting away the VM from you, just to keep it simple and keep it out of mind and just get you to the application itself. But you can still get at some more details if you know where to look. One last thing I'll show you here, not the site extensions actually, but rather the tools. So if you turned on a few of those logging checkboxes, and you want to get like a bunch of those log files all kind of taken down as a single dump, then you can get it from here. So you just hit Diagnostic Dump from Tools, and it downloads a zip file that contains, if I'll show you one here, but basically it kind of goes and pulls out those different log files based on what you turned on, and just brings them in a convenient way, so all of them are kind of combined into a single folder. So that's in terms of the debugging and so on. There's a lot to kind of play around with in that arena, but that should kind of get you started. At least you'll be aware of the existence of this advanced version of the debugging and the access to the VM itself. Okay, so I think the next area I want to touch on, but I want to kind of be mindful of the time as well, is what you gain. Part of what I really like about what Azure gives us is, we've set up this app service. It took, a grand total of like a minute or two to have an app up and running. The VM is set up. Maybe even auto-scaling rules are turned on. We got a URL to begin with, and we can kind of hook it up, deploy code to it from Visual Studio. I'm not going to show you kind of setting all that up, but basically, if you're logged in with your Azure account, then it's really as simple as just hit publish, and you might have to configure a couple of things to begin with, but they're just like about logging in and select what is the target app service that you want to push your code to. But it really becomes as simple as right-click on the project, hit publish, and off it goes. So it already starts, it builds, it publishes it, and then once it's done, it'll spin up the actual URL. Which it usually takes like literally 30 seconds to go through all of that. So usually that's very quick way to get up and running. And of course, the Microsoft tooling is really good from, it integrates really well with each other. So Visual Studio support is top notch, of course. But what's really cool about it, I think, is what you get. You see now it finished kind of deploying to that. And I kind of won't let it load because that website actually doesn't do anything. But basically, you saw that it already deployed the latest version of the code and pushed it out there. But what I want to show you here is, some of the things you get by, like very easily, you can get some of these things. And a big example of that is authentication authorization. So I just want to show you that very quickly. So I've deployed an API. And I haven't had time to turn on or to kind of install a fully thought out authorization authentication scheme and modify the code and do all of that. Well, actually, you don't have to do much of that if you just need kind of to get started. This is an approach that you can turn on easily, but then later keep kind of customizing it into the full version that you want. So all I have to do here is turn on app authentication from the portal. And what's interesting about this is that the code is hosted here. So what Azure is going to do is any request that comes to that code, first it's going to have to go through this layer. And then if it passes whatever we tell it to do here, then it will it'll allow that request to get through to the code. So the code itself, in order to turn on authentication, actually the code, you require no code changes. You just have to turn it on from the portal. And then here, for example, I say that what do I want to do when there's a request that's coming in that's not authenticated? I might tell it to force the user to log in with Azure Active Directory. So, if you're familiar with Azure Active Directory, it's kind of ubiquitous at most enterprises that have Windows as their, operating system of choice. It's kind of robust in the enterprise and so on. Actually, it takes a few clicks to have all of that replicated into an Azure Active Directory setup. So, for example, my company, we have that immediately replicated to Azure Active Directory, which means that I can very easily create an API or an app. And then with 2 clicks here, I can tell it, okay, let's kind of turn on authentication using Azure Active Directory. And as soon as I finish configuring this, which I'll show you in 1 second, as soon as that's finished, all of the people in my company can access my API, but no one else. So it doesn't require code changes. It requires just a few clicks. Management mode is Express. I can create a new AD app, give it this name. Let's go here with AD app and hit OK. And that's it. It's configured to use Azure Active Directory for this application. I'm going to go save. And that's it. It's done. So if I go back to this and try to access this website, it's actually going to reject my attempt to access this. There's a couple of things you have to set up to make sure it's kind of, usually what it does is it will redirect you to a Microsoft login page, which is for the company, but you just have to do a couple more configurations on the Azure Active Directory side to kind of make sure it's allowed to do that. So that's kind of how quickly you can turn it on. And you can see here that you can set it up with Google, Facebook, Twitter, or Microsoft Live accounts in general. So you can have kind of authentication turned on very cheaply with just a few clicks without the application worrying about it even. One interesting thing that it will do as well, just in case you want authentication, but you maybe also want to know what the username is, who's the user that's authenticated from the code. So since this is all done at the portal level, actually what it does is once it passes through this hurdle of authentication at the portal side, Azure itself, before passing the request to your code, will inject a header with a special name, and the value of it will be the username that's authenticated. So without really touching the code at all, you already can get authentication and you can get the username by accessing that header that you expect to find in the code once it's passed through authentication. So I'll keep going here, but that's really, I thought, a very nice kind of feature to highlight. And very similarly, application insights is a couple of clicks and you have application performance monitoring and error handling turned on, which will create a separate resource for that. But because I'm kind of turning it on from inside this application, as soon as I finish setting that up, it's gonna already create it, hook it up, and I can already see some additional monitoring and request logging and all of that. So this kind of speed in terms of latching on things that usually required a lot of configuration and setup is what I'm kind of been enjoying a lot in kind of leveraging Azure for all of these things. There's a lot more, but I don't want to kind of take too much of your time. I think we were not meant to go for too long. I'll mention, by name, just a couple more things that I use all the time, and then the rest kind of we can either talk offline or set up another session if needed, or just let you guys explore it. You have your SQL databases, so Azure SQL DB, which is the SQL server in the cloud. They've actually set that up as a platform as a service offering, so you don't have to worry about managing the boxes and all that. They've recently added MySQL and Postgre as well, so you can kind of get that all here. They have a pretty powerful NoSQL DB offering as well called Cosmos DB. It's the kind of a rebranding and a brand new kind of set of capabilities on top of something, the previous version of it that existed, which was more limited, called Document DB, Azure Document DB. So Azure Cosmos DB is the NoSQL offering. Couple of clicks to get that set up. Very easy to work with as well. And then you can get some things like Azure Search. So imagine your website. A lot of websites, depending on the content, they may have the need for turning on search. Usually that's its own kind of set of activities. But in the same level of difficulty that I showed you for turning on authentication and authorization and application performance monitoring, with a few clicks, you create a resource for search, and you've already configured it to kind of you train it, you unleash it on one of your databases. It will create an index for you, and then that's it. You can just call the URL. A few clicks later, you're ready to go, and you can call the URL with search parameters, and it will be able to kind of you get kind of world-class level searching just with a few clicks set up for you. And there's of course the whole gamut of stuff related to the VMs and setting up all of that, but I haven't quite spent too much time on that personally, just because it's been I've been happy with the level of abstraction that the app services and all that provides me. There is Azure Functions. That's kind of serverless architecture, hosting functions in the cloud. That's kind of really cool stuff. I've been playing around with that a lot recently. It's under the app services kind of idea as well. So most of the stuff I showed you today applies to Azure Functions, and it's quite easy to create as well and get started and play around with it. And I noticed today when I was kind of checking it out that they allow you to create functions in F# as well. So that should keep you guys very happy as well. Finally, I guess I will just mention this, which I've been using a lot recently, Azure Cognitive Services. Now, I don't know that this is kind of something that most people will have a need for right away, but it is really, very, very accessible, very easy to get started with. And it's, a set of APIs that are giving you kind of AI access, be it vision or speech or whatnot, So for example, speech, you can kind of call an API, or let me talk about this one here, the video indexer. So I'm using that heavily here for one of my projects. Essentially, you can upload a video and it will run a bunch of analysis on it. It will kind of transcribe the text and give you, what are the main topics that came up during that presentation, who were the speakers, and if they are known speakers, it will actually grab their thumbnail and even identify them by name. And this is just, calling an API and parsing the JSON. That's kind of the level of power you can get with just a couple of API calls. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to show you guys on the first run. So any thoughts, questions, comments?
I mean, I am just blown away.
Awesome.
I had this idea of Azure from my previous experience a couple of years back. And Odi Bebu, who is another Cartel member, he showed me a little bit more. I was surprised, but now that you gave us like this very clear test drive, all I can say is wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great product. I mean, I don't know what Amazon is going to do now. Like the ball is on their court.
Right. So at my work, we use kind of all the cloud providers.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always this ongoing kind of competition going like, oh, Azure came up with this feature, and then AWS comes up with something else, and it's a constant kind of back and forth. I think they're both very strong, and they are kind of shine in their own areas, but they're converging on each other's feature sets.
So
And then they're going to end up competing on price, which is good for us, right? So that's how I see it, and just if you're living in the cloud already, then you're already kind of, you have one foot into that world, and the rest is just getting better and better over time.
so you mentioned there being some differences where
Yeah.
each one is better than the other. Um, can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, this is a little bit of a hotly contested topic, but I'll give you the MJ personal opinion on that.
Mm-hmm.
From what I've seen, AWS came first. It has more maturity to begin with, but when they came in, they really wanted to focus on the IaaS offerings. So it was infrastructure as a service was their strong suit, and they kind of didn't do a lot in the platform as a service arena. So Azure comes a few years later, and they want to compete, so they kind of double down on the platform as a service stuff. So they start to kind of lean in on this Azure App Service stuff. They start to create all these like really kind of easy to get started services, and not really trying to compete that hard on the infrastructure as a service stuff. So the VMs and the networks, like the virtual networks that you can set up, and that kind of versatility that you get on the AWS side, they didn't want to lean in on that yet. They wanted to kind of differentiate themselves from the PaaS side. So they each had their strengths, but then they both kind of, let's say, conquered that mountain. So then they start to compete and catch up in the one that they're missing. So AWS starts to kind of bring up features that are more and more for catching up on the PaaS side, and Azure started to kind of strengthen their story on the IaaS side as well. So I really see it as there's still a little bit of distinction. I think Microsoft is still a little bit more PaaS suitable, AWS a little bit more IaaS suitable. And just AWS has a little bit of stronger, let's say, track record in terms of stability, just being around for so long. But really, the difference is from the end, from like the perspective of an end user or even a company, aren't that big. They're both backed by like SLAs. Just let's say AWS can say something like, it's gonna stay. The SLA is like 99.99999% of the time it's going to have uptime, whereas Microsoft can only say something like 99.99. So it's really like the distinction is so minute right now in terms of that level. But the strengths, I see them as, PaaS versus IaaS. And in some areas, Microsoft in general is just a bit stronger. So for example, like the artificial intelligence stuff, the Microsoft stuff is just super advanced. Like, so we're having like a hackathon at work for the artificial intelligence stuff. So we've been kind of going crazy on all the services from Azure, from Google, from AWS, even Watson. And the stuff from Azure is just, above and beyond, just so advanced already and so easy to use that it's really differentiating itself in that regard, to be honest.
That surprised me. I didn't know they had that service.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and like I had someone approach me not long ago to do some, video processing, to like image recognition, faces, all that stuff. And I said, well, I have to develop my own service, yada, yada, yada. But knowing that I can just hook up an API, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much, you don't really have to think twice about it.
Yes.
Just go with that and do it. And so in terms of automation, can you automate all those steps through an API call? Like, can I automate releasing code to Azure? Is that an API that lets me do all of the actions that are done through the dashboard?
Yes, absolutely. So that's kind of a huge area of Azure as well. So everything is actually backed by REST APIs. That's number one. Two, they have actually a very mature like CLI story. So a lot of the stuff you can do in Azure CLI tools, be it on Linux, be it in PowerShell, be it in Windows. It's the kind of all of that is available. And then they have something called ARM. So that's Azure Resource Management, I believe, which is basically infrastructure as code, if you're familiar. So that's kind of how you can configure, it looks like JSON. You set up the JSON file to describe exactly what you want your, let's say, resource group and app service plan and app service and all that to look like. And then with a couple of commands with the CLI, it will go ahead and provision exactly how you described it in that ARM template.
So like a chef script.
Yeah, just exactly Azure specific, but yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and here even they introduced like the access to this Bash shell with PowerShell coming soon, actually, from the portal. So you can actually, just log into the portal from any device or any machine, and just turn this on, and you can actually start to use the Azure CLI to do stuff. So you don't even need to navigate through the tabs the way we were doing it, but you can just start, unleashing commands from the terminal in the browser.
Wow. I mean, wow! I'm blown away. I gotta say, yeah.
I should mention one more thing, which is actually that there is now like a mobile app too to do all of this Azure Portal, including this terminal. So there was like a preview in build where, one of the guys, Scott Hanselman, he was saying like he's having dinner at like Chili's with his family, and he's like deploying stuff to Azure production via the CLI,
I mean, are you sure you don't work with Microsoft, MJ?
Hey, no, man, I just like the direction they're going,
I knew, honestly, I knew that this would have been like a really informative session, because I'm gonna need to go and take a rest for a while, because I feel like so much information concentrated. I mean, I've learned a lot. I don't know about any of the other guys, but I just got so much from this. I gotta say thank you so much for doing this. I'm definitely gonna come back to this video, and now I want to go and learn more about Azure. I was always a bit careful not to start learning platforms, because they suddenly you fall into them and then you can't get out.
Right.
But this was definitely one that I want to learn, because it's definitely something that is not, I don't want to say like the future, but it's like you're using Azure and you're definitely using something that's on the cutting edge of things. And so that's, wow, I'm blown away. So kind of small question, what kind of integration exists with Visual Studio Code? For those of us who don't use Windows, do you know if there's any kind of integration similar to the one with Visual Studio?
So to be honest, I haven't used Visual Studio Code for that purpose personally, but I'm like 99% sure that it has top-notch support, of course, because you can do everything I showed you from the CLI, and it's very easy, which is available class platform. So okay. I can only imagine that somebody hooked up some sort of plugin. If not, it already comes out with VS Code by default.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's definitely something I'm going to check out. So this has been MJ Alwajeeh with the Lambda Cartel. He gave us a very nice Azure test drive. And thank you so much, MJ.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Hopefully we'll see you again in the future doing another awesome Tech Talk. And let me say, this was your first Tech Talk, and you aced it.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, and see you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot. See ya.